Okay, good morning, good afternoon, everyone, wherever you are. Welcome to this session. It's Friday afternoon, and normally this would be the graveyard slot in World Water Week, where people have already headed home, or people are enjoying the late August sunshine in Stockholm, or just fed up of sitting in a conference room for the whole week. So it's good to see a fair few of you logged in, and I know that there's some more people joining in the next few minutes or so. My name is Tom Williams, and I'm Director for Water at the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. And today's session is co-convened by WBCSD and the Beverage Industry Environmental Roundtable, aka BEER. And the topic is water circularity metrics for industry, which is part of a joint project between WBCSD and BEER. Before we move on to the session, just some housekeeping. You would have just seen a message come up that this session will be recorded. We will be sharing the slides and the recording with all registered participants after today's event. Please do use the chat function to post your questions or your comments. If there's some interesting resources that you want to share with the group, you can use the chat function. And we'll have an opportunity when we do the panel discussion to take some questions from the audience. So any questions for any of the speakers that come up today, then please feel free to use the chat function. Today's agenda, after I'm done, we're going to have three fairly rapid presentations to set the scene. We're going to have the background and the rationale to the work that we're presenting today. Then we're going to have some insight into a framework on circular transition indicators for business, an overview of the water circularity metric methodology that's in development at the moment, a panel discussion with some industry representatives, and an opportunity, as I mentioned, to take some questions also from the audience. And then we'll wrap things up about 40 minutes time with some next steps and close. Here are your speakers for today. Nick, who is the Executive Director with BEER, my colleague Caroline, who is managing the circular economy in World Business Council for Sustainable Development, Oliver, who is the consultant working on the water circularity metric development, Niels from Dow, and we have Jada from Heineken. So those are your speakers. As I mentioned, we're going to have three fairly rapid scene setting presentations before leading ourselves into the panel discussion. And again, any questions that come up, please use the chat function and we'll try to get to those during the panel discussion. But without further ado, I want to hand over to Nick, who's going to give us a little bit of background and context to what we're talking about today. So Nick, over to you.
Great, appreciate it. Thanks, Tom. And thanks for everyone joining today. I know World Water Week's been a bit different this year, like everything else, but hopefully you've still found a bit of inspiration in a lot of these sessions. So I hope you do today as well. Tom, go to the next slide, please. So I'm Nick Martin, like Tom said, Executive Director of the Beverage Industry Environmental Roundtable, or BEER, and also Sustainability Practice Lead at Antea Group. I'm going to kick us off today just with a little bit of background around kind of the foundational concept on this work. And what we really have set out to do here is to challenge facilities. We want to challenge the way they've looked at water throughout the world. Traditionally, facilities have really looked at water more as a utility, something that they source, something they use, and then something they discharge. And it becomes kind of a very repetitive part of their business and something that is just accounted for and very operational. What we want to try to do this work is really challenge that. Challenge them to think about how do they handle water and how could they optimize kind of every drop they touch in an ideal world. But really just to get them to think about that. And, you know, the idea is that water is really inherently circular. So how do we transition from that traditional linear type thinking to more of the circular thinking and thinking about how do we do our part as a facility to help replenish the watershed and the health of the watershed and make it more sustainable. And really the idea here is that a facility should think about their sourcing. You know, how do they reduce how much they source? How do they source from the most sustainable options available to their facility? Once they have the water, how do they reuse it in their operations and think about it through their different process steps? How do they look at their discharge and how do they recycle water? Recycling water on site and then also, recycling water off site for various purposes. Instead of just discharging to where you always discharge, is there another option that can be more beneficial to the local watershed or basin, and then also support your operations longer term? And really the objective behind this is how can we measure that? Is there a metric or a set of metrics we could put together to help a facility really measure how circular is their water management? How circular is the sourcing, the use, and the discharge? And so that's what we've set out with this team to try to tackle and to try to do it in a very practical way. And to give a tool that can really be used by a broad range of facilities. Obviously from the beverage sector, we have interest, but we want this to be relevant to all sectors, you'll see here today. Next one, please. So this work originated kind of twofold, and we say, why water circularity metrics, why now, and why did our two organizations come together? From the beer perspective, it was really a bottom-up type of approach. So earlier this year, we published the guide you see here on the slide, the context-based decision guide for water reuse recycling. The intention behind that guide was to be a very practical guide to help a facility just think, what are the opportunities for the 3 R's of reuse, reduce, reuse, recycle, both on-site and off-site. But at the end of the day, we had that guide and we said, well, how do you measure that? How does a facility know that they're progressing? We need something to be able to measure and to kind of monitor that, especially across multiple facilities. And then, a bit in parallel, WBCSD was also working on their circular transition indicator tool. And as they worked through that process, they realized that the water was unique and that there were some certain aspects that they needed to really think through to be able to integrate it into that tool set. And our two organizations came together attempting to meet both of those needs and kind of meet in the middle on a new method and a new set of indicators. So that's where we are today. We're making progress, happy to really share this and happy to get your feedback from a wide range of stakeholders here. So with that, I'm going to pass to Caroline to talk a little bit more about the CTI and the work of WBCSD. Caroline?
Thank you very much, Nick. That was a great introduction already. Can I get the next slide, Tom? So I'd be happy to share a little bit about our work on metrics in the circular economy in general in WBCSD. The Circular Transition Indicators Framework is a self-assessment tool for businesses to measure and manage their organization's circularity. The methodology is described in the publication that you see on the screen, accompanied by a CTI online tool that helps companies to collect data that they need to do the calculations, but then also to prioritize its response to exposed risk and the identified opportunities. Next slide, please. So just to tell you a little bit about the context in which the CTI was developed. About 2 years ago, the companies in our circular economy working group started asking themselves, if this world and our economy indeed is 9% circular, which it is, what does that actually mean for our organization? How circular are we? How circular should we be? What are relevant targets? And how do we measure progress as we start to work on these more circular solutions? So they set out to develop this framework with an advisory group of 8 influential organizations within the circular economy that you see here on the screen as well. And the objective was to really to provide insight into the circular performance on a company level, driving the circular transition through the adoption of circular business models that will improve company longevity and resilience. So there's a real business need behind the need for this framework. The key principles of the methodology itself, already at the start of development, we agreed was that it had to be simple, it had to be consistent, so universal for all companies, regardless of size, industry, or value chain position. The framework had to be complete, It had to be complementary to existing sustainability metrics and frameworks, so not replace anything. And it had to be neutral in the sense that it's objective, quantitative, and based on demonstrable data. Can I go to the next slide? So just a quick snapshot of how it works, because this will relate to the methodology that Oliver will get into in a little bit as well. We wanted to look at what is in full control of a company, and therefore the CTI focuses on materials that flow within the company's boundary. The framework can be used for circular performance assessment at different levels. So you can look at a company level or a business unit level or a product line level. And the result of the circularity assessment is expressed in a percentage for, on one end, circular inflow, and on the other end, circular outflow, which directly represents the balance between circular and linear flows. So the circularity of a company is determined by analysis at 3 key intervention points. First of all, it looks at the point of inflow. So how much of the company's sourced material is circular? Secondly, it looks at the point of, it looks at a flow's recovery potential at the point of design. So does the company design its product so that technically they can be repaired, refurbished, or recycled? So very much a design criteria. And lastly, it looks at the point when materials leave the company boundary in the percentage of actual recovery, asking to what extent does the company use its business models or work with its value chain partners in order to ensure that materials and products that may have been designed for circularity in actual effect do get collected and reintroduced into the economy after their initial end of life. So it's those 3 key intervention points that we use to assess circularity. Then, can I go to the next slide, Tom? Thank you. So that's how a company's ability to close the loop of materials is evaluated. And in that, both water and renewable energy are an important part of the circular economy. So we assess them in separate indicators. And as you can see here, the water circularity indicator is still gray, since at the time of the launch of CTI version 1.0, we had not succeeded yet in developing a metric that considered, well, mainly the regional context of water circularity. That we needed to put more thought into that. So we've been very excited to have been part of the development of this particular water circularity metrics to really bridge the CTI with the global initiative, or the larger initiative on circular water management. So we consider this set of indicators as the essential base of the CTI, and we've grouped these 4 indicators together in the closing the loop indicator module. Every company will start their CTI assessment by completing this module, so including the water circularity indicator. For companies that want to gain additional insight, CTI offers extra indicators in 2 additional modules, of which one is Optimize the Loop, which focuses on optimizing resource use and providing insight on prioritization of material flows, and Value the Loop, focusing on the link between a company's circular material flows and its financial performance. So over time, this indicator will be able to demonstrate success in decoupling economic growth from linear material consumption. So besides the water circularity indicator, other additional indicators are currently being developed and will be included in the CTI version 2.0, which is planned to be launched in January next year. My last slide, please, Tom. Thank you. So finally, just to wrap this up, CTI follows a process that helps companies with a structured approach to their assessment, making sure that not only they start with meaningful scoping of their own assessment based on the company's priorities, but it also makes sure that we look beyond receiving the direct results of a certain percentage. And it really helps to interpret the outcomes and take measured and meaningful action on the learnings, which can then be managed in an annual cycle. This was a super high snapshot. But if you would like to learn more about this, please feel free to visit this link. As you'll get the deck, you'll receive this as well. yeah, and keep in touch. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Caroline. I think that, as you mentioned, nicely sets the scene for Oliver, who's now going to introduce the water circularity metric methodology development to date. So Oliver, over to you.
Thank you, Tom. And yeah, thank you everyone for joining us today. Please, the first slide, thank you. So today I want to, first I want to give you like a first overview and acknowledgement of those companies who have been involved in the process and have brought in a huge amount of knowledge and experience into this project itself. So you can see there's quite a good list of stakeholders from the beverage industry, the chemicals, water utilities, oil and gas, but also consumer goods or packaging industry. We also, in addition to that, have a stakeholder advisory group who provide additional insight to the work we're coming up with and testing out with the different companies from academia within the sustainability, life cycle and evidence-based innovation issues on, basically on global water issues. Then we have consulting companies as well as NGOs, both from the reporting as well as the environmental think tank side of things. So this gives like a good and critical group to help us tackle this issue and provide insight, but we also of course welcome your insights on that as well. Thank you, Tom, for the next slide. So at the beginning, we had to first think about, okay, what are the principles of development here? What do we actually want to achieve? And as Caroline and also Nick already showed beforehand, we're looking into, okay, how can a water circularity metric actually help us to measure how to close the loop in water on local water cycles, but also if that's not possible, how we can actually optimize these kind of loops. So what really do we want to do? We want to look into the use and the consumption of water within individual operations and production of goods. And then we also want to embrace, of course, the going towards the circular water principles, to go away from the typical linear view. Then of course, one of the major issues is the consensus on the terminology used. There are many different references to all to the circular principles in general. And we first had to think about, okay, how can we have at least a common set for all those different types of industries for this particular project. And then, of course, the outcome of that should be that we have a metric or a set of metrics that helps us to measure over time the progress of a company and also demonstrate kind of the positive impact here. Next slide, please. So I want to give you a brief introduction on kind of the different components of the methodology. And we have here kind of very simplistic model that is still kind of based on the linear way. But in order to get kind of to the circular thinking, we need to pick up the users or the audiences from basically where we're coming from. So we're looking at the water sources a company uses and that go into a facility for production. We look what happens within the site itself, and then we also looking in detail where's the water going afterwards. And we do that here in a way, okay, is the water coming from the local watershed, and actually does it return to the local watershed, and in which way and form? Or also if it leaves the local watershed, for example, through product and other losses and processes, for example. And here we have really two sides, like those two components, and we have seen that already in Caroline's presentation before. We have the circular, what we call like the circular water inflow and the circular water outflow, that in a combined way give us a location-based metric. On the inflow side in particular, we are looking at what does it actually mean to have circular water? Is the source we're using for the production, is it like a circular source, or is it like can be considered as a linear source? And we're looking here more in detail if the particular source can be replenished faster than it's actually being withdrawn. And of course, this is kind of one of the key issues we crunching through with our working groups to get like this common sense of like what can actually be considered a circular and a linear source here. Then on the other side, we're looking in particular on water quality components. Is the water actually being returned in a way, or safely returned up to the current regulations, best industry practices, and so on. So people can or should show they're not only reporting what is actually could be considered circular, but also provide like evidence why it can be why they think it can be considered as circular. So we kind of can backtrack and bring those different sides together. And of course, and that's what Nick mentioned already at the beginning, it's very important to actually think about, okay, how can we make the most out of the precious water sources we have? Like, are there maybe other water sources available that are of better quality fit? Are they closer to the quality we actually need? Question yourself, are there other facilities around that could provide you with water that actually would suit your production? And of course, on the other side, when we look on the outflow of the actual on operations itself. And so when we then bring this all together, we have we should come up with the location-based metric of water circularity, and as well as an internal metric that helps us to understand what's happening within the actual site. And then, of course, so this is, of course, all very simplistic, looking at the in and outflows, but this is kind of a good basis to help us then to unpack additional layers where water is coming from, where it goes to. We can look at water that's basically coming from nature-managed sources, and on the other side from human-managed sources, like, for example, the third-party reclaimed water. And of course, also on the outflow side, we can think about, okay, is that water be usable and like suitable for other purposes before we discharge it, for example, back into the local aquifer. And of course, this set of indicators should, and when we ask these questions, how you can provide this information for those individual inputs for to basically reach your calculation of the circular water metric, is also, yeah, you ask always yourself, what is the best fit and water needs? Could you find a better source of water, maybe even only in the future? Are there ways how you can minimize the impact on the water, both on quality and quantity, as well as on when it goes out? Okay, are there other ways to reuse or recycle the water accordingly? So, and then in addition to that, as that goes back to Caroline's presentation as well. So we have the water circularity metric, but we have a whole group of other metrics that can then help to support the look at water circularity. So we can also look, for example, at the water use or withdrawal reduction. We can look at the nutrient and energy recovery, also in conjunction with actual water, with energy or substance use to change water quality. So when you track this over time, you can have a feel of how your water circularity might change, but also how it impacts on other indicators like additional resources you might need or additional energy you might use. So this was a very quick overview of the methodology. If you have more questions, of course, come back to us to get a better understanding also of the actual underlying calculations. And thank you everyone for being here today. You're still on mute, Tom.
Thank you, Oliver. You'd think we'd know how to use these things now. Thanks for that, Oliver. As Oliver mentioned, any questions that you have for him or for Nick or Caroline, please use the chat function and we will get to those questions as part of this panel discussion that we're going to have now. Really, the main intent of this panel discussion is to bring on board two of the companies that are a part of this water circularity metric development, and really get their insights into why circular water management is important for their company, what they're doing about it, and then how the water circularity metric can actually help their strategies. So I'm going to ask Niels and Jada if you can put your cameras on. And Niels, I want to start with you. Dow has been doing some pioneering work in this space of circular water management for some time now, with a leading example of one of your facilities in the Netherlands. How important has circular water management become as part of your global water strategy, and how could a circular water metric support your ongoing efforts?
Thanks, Tom. Yeah, as an introduction, yeah, I'm employed at Dow Chemical Company as a water specialist. Also have a part-time position as a water professor in water technology. Water is of vital importance for Dow as a chemical producer because it enables us to sustain our operations globally. We do have a global water strategy which targets at sustainable water use, and in particular in water-stressed areas. We have set a number of goals to reduce our water intensity for our highest priority locations, and we drive water circularity at our production sites by, for example, closing internal loops, reusing our internal wastewater, reuse the steam condensates, and we design our processes that require less water, like a new PO process, together with BASF, but also by external collaboration, by, for example, reusing municipal effluent in our premises. And we do that with both public and private partners, and also exploring reclamation and applying innovative solutions like green infrastructure, wetlands, and underground storage of fresh water. In fact, metrics, they are a major tool to communicate, both internally and externally, and they are really enabling us to reach higher awareness levels. We can measure progress, of course. We can track our improvements, and yeah, it's also a great example if you execute that for 1 or 2 sites, that you can copy that to the broader Dow Chemical Company for sites which are not that far yet.
Great, thank you, Niels. And we'll come back to you with some further questions in a second. Jada, I want to move on to you. Heineken, as a company and collaboratively with your peers through beer, have continued to advance the importance of reducing, reusing and recycling water throughout your operations across the globe. How big is the opportunity in your mind with treated wastewater and offsite circularity specifically?
Great, thank you. Thanks for having me here. My name is Jade Loureiro. I'm representing Heineken, as I mentioned, as a global water lead. I work in the global production, sustainable production department, leading the Every Drop strategy. So Every Drop is our water agenda towards 2030. We just launched last year, and we apply for all sites in water stress areas. So as we speak, we have 29 sites distributed among 13 countries. And the idea is to have the local context targets related to the local challenge, right? So Every Drop has 3 elements. With the watershed health in the center. So whatever we do, we need to ensure this alignment and make the decision accordingly. And the first element is the water stewardship, where basically the idea is to balance the water we use in our products, but now we also want to have collective actions with other stakeholders so we can increase the benefits for the local watershed. The second element is the water efficiency, already common among the industry, reduce, reuse, recycle. And the third element, and the new element, is water circularity. So with water circularity, we say that we are closing the loop, the water loop within our operations. And for our circularity, the intention is to look at the wastewater treatment plants as a resource factory, where we can recover energy, nutrients, use as a fertilizer, the sludge, and also use treated effluent. The treated effluent, the idea is not only to recycle it on site in our operations, as we are doing already in several locations with water reclamation plants, but it's also, and especially with other users outside of the brewery, with the off-site recycle. The intention is to engage and find these these next users around the breweries and the local watershed, and understand how can we keep the water flowing for other operations in the nearby operations. And especially some examples are other industries, for instance, paper mill industry, farmers, and also applying for nature. And right now we are the production units around applicable for the strategy are building the roadmaps to understand what we need to do to meet the targets for the next 10 years, as I mentioned. And the main challenge right now is to understand the quality requirements of these next users, volumes, needs, and also local legislation restrictions. So we need to understand how to find the best win-win approach to engage with these stakeholders and address their needs. So that's why I understand the water circularity metrics methodology being discussed today is so important to set clear guidance and definitions, and also create the awareness among the industry. So glad to answer a few questions, if any. Thank you. Back to you, Tom.
Great, thank you very much, Jada. And there's a few questions coming in. Do keep them coming in for Jada, for Niels, or any of the other speakers. I want to go to a question that we've got in for Niels. This is coming from Eleanor Rainey from BP. Niels, could you highlight the biggest achievement in water management in the last couple of years at your site in the Netherlands?
Yeah, thanks. What we have done most, and it's a trajectory of almost 15 to 20 years now, is to enhance our recycle of various different sources. We started to reuse our own wastewater as makeup water for cooling towers, and along to that we also started reusing water from the effluent of the municipal plant in the city of Terneuzen. To produce demineralized water, and we do that together with an external partner, Evidence, the water company. So that's set in place, and actually by doing so we were able to have about 75% of our sources being from sustainable use, instead of fresh water, which is say either used for potable water production or directly discharged. Yeah, our next steps are actually to close that circularity completely and have our say sources 100% reused, sustainable by 2025.
Great, thank you very much for that, Niels. I wanted to pick up some questions that have been coming in about the model that is being used, Oliver, for the methodology. Maybe you could, Oliver, just give a bit of insight in terms of how the methodology is being developed, how you're starting to test that with some of those companies you mentioned earlier. And then I'll come to a question for Caroline on how some of the companies are using the CTI framework. But first, Oliver, could you give a bit of insight in terms of the models being used and how you're engaging with these companies with the methodology development?
So basically, as you have seen on the different components of the draft methodology, we first of all try to build like a very basic Excel tool to start engaging the different companies. To first of all understand, okay, does it actually make sense to you? I mean, when lots of the companies already, for example, engage in a GRI reporting, so it goes a little bit in that direction where companies might already have data readily available, but then also use basically information out of their processes to bring in here, and then to look at the different flows and the relation to each other, and then use this tool basically to understand from each company what is their thinking in terms of like what for each source is like, how can we consider this as, for example, circular or linear. So of course everyone has different approaches and already has like a different progress in their own circularity journey on their particular side. So we wanted to kind of figure out, okay, does this model make sense in terms of the flows we're looking at, and also basically the fractions of flows within, for example, the inflow and the outflow. How does that come together, and is it actually measurable or not? We had many discussions, for example, with the internal circulation of water, that sometimes it's measured, sometimes it's really up to different types of processes, and it's actually very hard to quantify. So there are like these different, like everyone knows, it's kind of there, but it's not really measured, so we don't really want to change kind of the process, but basically have the starting point where we can start to think, okay, we can consider a certain volume of water that is being used as circular and non-circular, but then also further on think about, and that's what we already built into the tool, to go actually one step further to understand, like, is the water actually coming directly from a natural resource, or is it actually already reused or recycled from another side, to really get this deep understanding of where the water is coming from, where it goes, to basically tackle this question: can we add more value to that water? So you have basically the current situation of the water flows, but then when you look into the future, what could, like, how is that potentially changing? Will you have more water stress that will impact on the availability of water, and therefore, again, if it can be considered circular? And we try, like, with the different companies to get an understanding with these specific industries and also their particular operations, if that actually makes sense. We also try to integrate a better view on water quality issues. Of course, this is also like a challenge, because you have every industry has like different types of water quality parameters. It's very geographically depending on what you actually have to fulfill, what best practice you would apply. But yeah, just to give you like a rough idea. And so now we are in the period where we actually testing it out with the different companies from different industries, and then with different sides, from basically, yeah, water abundance to water scarce region, water quality issues or water quantity issues, to really get an idea of if the outcome actually makes sense coming out of this particular tool.
Great.
Yeah,
Thank you, Oliver. Caroline, I wanted to move on to you and sort of ask you about your experience with the CTI framework to date and how companies are using it. Are they primarily using it as part of their assessment analysis? Are they doing it to inform best practices? Niels mentioned that it becomes a very powerful communication tool, for example. What are you seeing in terms of the uptake of business as they adopt these the CTI framework?
Thank you for the question, Tom. I think what's good to realize is that still CTI was launched earlier this year in January, but it's still a very new tool, and this is it's not the first, but on a company level, it is one of the first frameworks that has tried to put definitions in place that would sort of harmonize language and really make sure that we have as was mentioned before, use common definitions and use the same methodology. So what we've seen in so far, the uptake and the interest in the framework is really quite high, higher than we I think initially even expected. So far, the tool in itself, the online tool, has over 350 accounts made. So the interest from business has been really high, and what we see, especially with the companies that are most active with this, they just want to explore and see how can we translate this universal framework and these definitions. What does that mean for our industry, and what does that mean for our organization? So to say that companies are already on a large scale using it to sort of feed into communication strategies, that's not how far it is yet. But we do see this sort of large convergence of companies saying, yes, this could work, but are still trying to figure out how does that mean, what does that mean for my company specifically. But so far it's been, we've had received feedback on things that still need to be improved, which is exactly why we're coming out with a 2.0 version next January. But we definitely also had companies that are a bit further progressed and that have given the feedback that the learnings that they get on their, just the insights into how materials flow through their company and the opportunities and the risks that they're exposed to that poses has been very, very useful already. And yeah, overall the feedback has been really good. But I also need to emphasize that it's not an easy 1 week exercise. And that's something that companies need to realize as well, because it does ask questions that might have never not been asked in the value chain yet. And that's where I think I see the water metric as well go. It will be sort of coining a new language, I would say, and companies will need to try it out and see if it works for them. And we will be there to hear how it works and if adjustment is needed, because this is something that we're building for businesses to use. It needs to be useful for them, and it really needs to be built on their business needs.
Great, thanks for that, Caroline. Jada, I want to move on back to you and see if I can take two questions into one from Luke and from Silva, which talks about engaging with other users, engaging also with water and wastewater operators, and handling some of the legal perspectives. Who takes the initiative in these partnerships? What's your experience?
No, that's a great question indeed. So the first thing is our corporate affair leads in each operation will lead the conversation and the stakeholder engagement. And when the local legislation already make it possible, we will engage directly with the other users. So it will be a easier process. But of course, if we see the need and if we can rely on the water bases also to work together with us, it will be even easier. When we have legal restrictions not allowing us to the reuse or maybe this kind of relation between companies, we need to first understand what are the barriers and plan what can we do to help or to reflect and discuss the limitations. We really believe once we have good projects or good examples demonstrating somewhere in the world what we are doing, what are the benefits, what's the intention behind off-site recycling, I understand that there is a room to negotiate and to explain to the local authorities and agree that that would be the best thing for the local watershed. Did I answer the question?
Yeah, thank you very much, Jada, for that. A final question for Niels. As I mentioned, introducing you, Niels, Dow's been at this for a while now. What do you think industry needs to do to sort of accelerate this circular water management journey? Metrics is just one part of a portfolio of tools and solutions, for example, but if we're really going to be successful, really be transformational in industrial water circularity, what more do we need to do, particularly collectively as a group of industries and not individually?
Yeah, well, I think there are two aspects, Tom. One being, say, preparing for the future. We anticipate the whole complete energy and raw material transition for the future, and we need to collectively work on processes which are really using less water and apply more integrated water, intrinsic water recycle systems in their process designs. So that's on the design level where we have to accelerate and to be early in the negotiations. And the second step, I would say, is to go outside your own fence and collaborate with public-private partners in the region to really build a sustainable water management system on a catch basin level. So collaborate with other private and public partners, but also with agriculture, with nature, to really establish a sustainable regional water management system.
Great, thanks for that, Niels, and thanks for picking up this notion of going beyond the fence. And I think it starts to address the question we had from Nathaniel, which was talking about how do we avoid, for example, rebound effects, which we see with water efficiency projects in agriculture, for example, where on-farm efficiency improves, but it doesn't actually improve sustainable water use at a basin scale. What we're doing with the water circularity metric is to make sure that the context on which it's applied is basin scale. So some of the data that will be used is basin scale data. One of the outputs, which I'll share in terms of the next steps in a second, is a landscape synthesis report. And this will be published towards the end of this year. And it will really position the water circularity metric within the broad water circularity metric target landscape to understand its boundaries, its limitations, and its application and how it should be used. But we are running out of time. I saw a question from Jesse, which was quite long. I promised that offline we'll get back to you on that question. I'm just going to share my screen once again so we can move through some final next steps. So as we presented, this is a work in progress. We've been at this since the beginning of the year. Where we are now is around phase, phase 2 and phase 3. So we're developing the metric and in the process of piloting with some of those member companies that you saw earlier. The final output of the project is a guidance document which will be supporting companies through the process of applying the water circularity metric. And ultimately what we will see is the water circularity metric becoming part of the CTI framework that Caroline presented earlier. So as always, it's a really short session we have at this World Water Week at Home. I'm sure there's lots more questions and information that you would like. We will share the slides and the recording of this session, but if you do want some more information about the circular transition indicators, please do reach out to Caroline. If you want some more information on water circularity metrics or more broadly the work that BEER and WBCSD is doing in this space, please feel free to reach out to Nick and myself. We're going to close there. It's been a great session. Thank you for all of your questions, and I'd like to thank our speakers. So thank you, Nick. Thank you, Caroline. Thank you, Oliver, and our panelists, Niels and Jada. Have a great rest of the World Water Week. I think there's a couple of sessions left. Have a great weekend and hope to see everybody soon. Take care.